Mark 7, verse 14. Mark 7:14, verse 2 to 23. We're at 9:30. We are live. Welcome to our Facebook viewers out there. All right, classes come to order. Order in the court, order in the classroom, order in the classroom. Mark 7:14 to 23 about cleanliness. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." For he had left the crowd and entered the house. His disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then out of his body." Saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within him, out of man's hearts, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean." So Jesus is carrying on this conversation about what do you have to do to be clean? The disciples were challenged about not washing their hands. Jesus is asking them to think. Verse 18, "Are you so dull?" Is that an offensive way to ask someone about their thought process? You know, is Mark a disciple of Jesus? No, he's not. He's not one of the 12. He's not one of the 12. He's the one that flees in the garden naked. When they grab his robe, he runs away. He's not one of the 12. And Mark, he seems to write in a way that he does not give honor to the disciples. He portrays them as pretty many times just simple-headed people. And here again, he stays with his theme. He quotes Jesus telling them, "Are you so dull? How thick is your skull? Can't you get through about this truth?" And Jesus tries to explain it again, but the truth of the matter is, clean and unclean. Why do they even have these rules? Why do they have these rules of clean and unclean? Some may be basic sanitation. So give me an example of an unclean animal. Pig. All right. So if it's unclean, why are we eating them now? How come you guys like pork? I love my pork chops. Yeah. What is the problem with the pig? Why do they have this distinction between clean and unclean? Oh, give me another example of an unclean animal. How many of you guys like, huh? Shellfish. Yep, that works. How many of you guys like catfish? Yeah. That's unclean. Can't eat fish without scales. Catfish, that's unclean. Sheep, they had sheep. That's clean. Hoofs. The way split. Yeah. The way the hoof was split. You know how a pig's hoof is split versus different than a lamb's. Right. Horse is unclean. So you've got these unclean and unclean animals. And you got this distinction of a pig, and you got the, catfish, you can't eat that, can't eat eel, can't eat shellfish. Could a Jew eat lobster? No. Yeah. Yeah. What's the point? Why we're eating them? If there was really anything wrong with them sanitational-wise, we would not be putting them on our diet now. Well, what's the point of this distinction? And how many animals did Noah bring on the ark?
Because that's the term I saw.
Two of each kind. But you're not giving me a chance to tell you you're wrong. Very good. Gesture.
You know where I learned that?
Where'd you get that?
Jared Wright.
I must have said this already. There were two unclean, a pair of unclean, so the unclean could continue to survive, but he brought 7 pairs of clean. 7 pairs of clean. You read up through Genesis, you'll see that Moses brought 7 pairs of clean. Why did Moses bring 7? Moses. How many? Yeah, Noah. Why did Noah bring 7 pairs of clean animals in verses 2, 1 pair of unclean? He had to have something to eat. If you would have killed the 2, you've extinguished the series.
How many pairs did he have?
I don't know. You have to ask the rabbits. So Noah, he had to have food. How many was he having to feed? He had to feed 8. 8. He had 8 on the ark. He had to feed 8 people. He had 7 pairs of clean animals up there. What else did Noah need to have the clean animals for? Not just for diet, but he also sacrifice. So Noah brings 7 pairs of clean and only 1 set of unclean. And I kind of find this fascinating because when did the unclean, clean stuff come into play? Afterwards, right? Came with the Moses law. There's where Moses comes in. I knew I was going to get to Moses. Moses was the one that made the clean and unclean laws, and he didn't exist in the time of Noah. So this clean and unclean thing continues to go on. What kind of message was being delivered by clean and unclean? What were the people of Israel reminding themselves? Rest of the world. Their diet was a way of communicating a witness that they were God's chosen people, that they were different from the rest. You know, the Gentiles were unclean and were clean. And the diet made that message, clean versus unclean. This aspect of when did the clean and unclean distinction really get removed in Christianity? When did it really get removed?
Did it not come from Paul when he was waiting for whatever was over his eyes at Ananias' house, that he had a dream?
Well, you're close, John, you're close. It's Acts chapter 10. It's Peter and Cornelius. Cornelius is a centurion, which means he's Roman. Therefore, Peter sees this Roman guy clean or unclean? Unclean. And if you look at Acts chapter 10, turn to that, Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10, at Acts chapter 10, verse 1, at Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. Who's this God he's praying to? Is it the God of Abraham?
It seems so.
It seems so. You'd almost have to conclude that it's not a Roman God or a Roman mythological God he's talking about, but he's around the people of Israel, and he's learned their faith and their customs and beliefs, and he inherits them, practices them. He starts worshiping this God of Abraham. Probably didn't know about the God of Abraham until he came into Israel. Or he may have known it in Italy, but we know that he's in a Jewish enclave, so to speak, country, and he is worshiping the God of Abraham. So one day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear. What is it, Lord? He asked. The angel answered, your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God, and I'll send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon who's called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea. Now this is fascinating a little bit too. All right, so Roman soldier is unclean. Trade, type of businesses is also categories of clean and unclean. What's a tanner do?
Here's leather.
Here's one.
So in order to cure leather, what do you have to be around? Dead animals. So does that make him unclean? Yeah, this is where as Peter becomes seemingly inconsistent, he's staying with an unclean trader, unclean businessman, tanner. He's got to be around death. If you're around death, you're unclean. Yet Peter stays there. So so the angel spoke to him and gone. Cornelius called two of his servants, and he devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. Well, about noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, God is now preparing Peter for this. Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry, wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles of the earth, birds of the air, like snakes, Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." And the voice spoke to him a second time, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." 3 times. And immediately the sheet was taken back into heaven. So Peter's kind of wondering about the meaning of the vision. And he finds out the meaning of the vision is strangers come knocking on his door, finds out they represent Cornelius and invite him to talk to this Roman soldier. So verse 19, skipping down a little bit, while Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you. Get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." Peter went down and said to the men, "I am the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" The men replied, "We have come for Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to have you come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say." Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guest. In the rest of the narrative, Peter goes over, and the people are kind of concerned to what Peter's doing as he enters into the house of a Gentile, and Peter has to defend his behavior and actions and said that God has said that these people are no longer unclean. So what event made the Gentiles clean? The resurrection of the blood of Jesus Christ, 2 walls become one, according to what Paul says in the book of Ephesians, the letter of Ephesians. So the Gentiles now are recognized as people worthy of the gospel. The distinction is removed, clean versus unclean. Peter defends his actions by those who are challenging him, and he says, "This comes from authority of God. This is what God told me to do." And Cornelius and his household, they all get baptized and come to the Christian faith. This distinction kind of hung around for a long time between the Jews and the Gentiles. Old stuff, old habits die hard. So you have a lot of Jewish Christians that still kind of believe that those distinctions should remain. And it was a very hard thing to get over. We don't have that problem now, do we? You know what I heard that, at the last circuit meeting, pastor circuit meeting, our denomination is number 2, a significant denomination. Among significant denominations, we rank number 2 in the most homogenous demographic group. We rank number 2. That's not a good thing.
Let's try it.
Have to try harder. Avis, yeah. Why is that not a good thing?
Because if you ain't number 1, you're last.
What if we're doing our job, what should our congregation look like? Whatever God wants it to be, but are we making it what God wants it to be, or are we sometimes holding on to our preferences, our sinful preferences? That the congregation should be a conglomeration of all races and nations. So, hey, I've done my job. I got a Filipino in here.
You brought yours with you.
I brought mine with me.
Two others.
Yeah, 2 others. Yeah, it's a Cambodian. Yeah, but is there? If we were to look at the demographic of Christ the King and the demographic of Waxahachie, Would they parallel? Would they match?
No.
My long shot. Why are they not matching?
Place of worship.
Style of worship is an issue.
Language barriers?
Sometimes maybe a language barrier.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Hispanic culture that make them more comfortable not speaking English all the time.
Yes. Spanish is their language they choose, and they prefer that rather than to learn the English, and that's their call. And Pastor Fingy?
I think unfortunately, we've had to finally come down to admitting that we don't make those people feel welcome.
Yeah. And I struggle with this aspect. As a pastor, how do you get your congregation to break the wall? You know, you would almost have the goal of a Christian congregation that the demographic of your congregation should match the demographic of Waxahachie. Somewhat close. If there's 10% African Americans, 10% of your congregation should be African Americans if you're doing your job. But you mentioned like styles of worship, things like this. So if the style of worship is a conflict, maybe the church ought to think about having another service that kind of appeals. But if you do that, what happens? If you start, you continue, you don't win, right? You go back to the same problem, segregation, and you're not bringing in the unity. That's one of the challenges I think in Hispanic services, and the Hispanic mission, sometime boards will talk to you about that go ahead and have a Hispanic service. And even when this Hispanic group came to me to talk about doing Hispanic service here, they mentioned the first thing you recognize is you don't bring the Hispanics into your Caucasian speaking service. You have to start over there. You have to kind of move them into that and get them into networking among themselves, and then you find ways to gather them in their worship style and homes, but the last thing you think about is integrating them in the worship service. And I just kind of wonder, is that defeating the purpose? How do you integrate us all? I just have a feeling that when we get to heaven, and we have one church, is anybody going to be claiming how the service is done?
But that's kind of the way it is. If you kind of think about it, the church is not just a Lutheran church.
Right.
It's also a Catholic.
Well, there's no Lutheran Catholic there. It's the community of saints.
The Christian church is everywhere.
You hear in this earth.
It's incredibly strong in Ethiopia,
Right.
which is all black,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's strong presence in China.
Yeah.
Growing fast. So is it just, we're just looking at the Lutheran church as being segregated and homogenous, but the Christian church is not.
I did my, what do they call it, field work in an inner city St. Louis church. It was African American. It was 90% African American. And when I had conversations with some of the members there of the church, the conversation brought up about we need to maybe bring in African American hymns, maybe do something different to appeal to more growth so that the neighborhood would be more welcomed and fit in. I had like three main leaders, African American leaders of the church, came to me. I didn't bring up I just was having the conversation, but they came to me and shared me their opinions. And they said, look, we joined this church because we want that liturgy. Don't mess us up. I thought, well, so there it is again. How do you work this through that even among African Americans that they can be open to one another and be willing to tolerate compromise to come together? Hey, Pastor Lanka, any advice down there when you were in Taiwan?
When I was there, as much as I tried to take on the mind and understanding of the world and of life from a Chinese point of view, as a foreigner, you just never arrive at that.
Yeah. And you look at that, and in heaven we will. I just love how Revelation says that he saw many tribes and nations, worshiping the Lord. He mentions the distinctions, John does in heaven, but no longer are the distinctions an obstacle to worship or to community in the church. So there is a challenge of we have to fight with our own preferences. Got quite a few here. Donna,
He was first.
No, I was just,
Oh, I'm sorry.
backing over to Norm.
Well, I was just gonna say, having worked with the Hispanics down in Mexico for the last 20-some years, when I first started working with these people, any service that I went to was very, for lack of a better term, I guess, Pentecostal in nature. A lot of interaction, a lot of noise, a lot of
Charisma.
whatever, and over the 20 years today, if you would go to most of the churches down there, they are following a liturgy just like we follow. In fact, if you go online and watch like the churches in San Pedro in Mexico City, if you knew the language, it would sound exactly the same as us. The only difference I've seen at this point, and maybe that's because of the pandemic, is that most of the music is being played on a guitar. I'm thinking because the younger pastors play the guitar and they don't have an organist, they can't get together at this point or whatever. And so, but they are, even using the guitar there, I can recognize the song.
Yeah.
Because it's our, same hymns that we're singing, only it's in Spanish. So.
Yeah. One of the things that I read back in the 80s, and I don't know if this is true anymore, but the Southwest, the South America, Central America, the Hispanic population, if they were to be of any religion, what religion did they belong to? Catholic. And in the 80s and 90s, you know what they were being, I don't want to say threatened, but most of what they were converting to, those that were nominal Catholic, what religion was making the biggest headway in South America? He mentioned it, Pentecostal. Pentecostal. It's amazing that they go from that Roman Catholic to that charismatic, but there was nothing, they weren't really moving to the middle at all, like looking at a Lutheran or a Baptist. They were going from Catholic, sliding way over to Pentecostal.
They had a movement in the United States too, to some degree.
It was big. It started off in California in the 70s, and from there on, it's established now, the Assembly of God and other Pentecostal churches. So the Pentecostal was a main thing. Donna?
Pastor, I've been here since the late 60s, and we've never had a lot of different ethnicities here. Never. I think we're a very friendly church.
Yeah.
I don't think that, I think whenever they come, it's just like my son-in-law, he deals with the Hispanics and he deals with the African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't come to his church.
I know.
They do their own thing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times maybe when you get someone who moves in from like maybe up north or something that's more familiar with Lutheranism, I think you might get them then.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they do things with all the churches, but they tend to want to stick to their own.
Yeah. You bring up a good point. When I was here within 3 months, somebody asked me a very, very good question. I was really impressed that it was the question I was debating on with the call when the call was offered to me about making a decision to come here or not. And I thought, wow, somebody actually thought the same question I did 6 months ago. The question was this, it came from the Vision Committee. Pastor, what do you think our growth is going to come from? Is it going to come from migration or from conversion? And I thought, well, there's the guy that just exactly what I was asking myself about the call process. Is our growth going to come from migration or conversion? Where's our primary growth going to come from? How will you guys answer that question? Yeah, but really, we need to kind of focus a little bit. And how you ever answer that question is going to dominate your philosophy of how you do the ministry here. You understand that, right? If you think it's going to be migration, that's one of the things I think Christ the King is getting better at. They're finding their identity. This church is finding its identity of who we are and where our growth is going to come from. If you are comfortable with that identity that we're going to go from migration, it's going to affect your philosophy and the way you run your church. Now, if you want to flip that and say our growth is going to come from conversion, that's going to emphasize a whole different thing about your mission dollars and everything else of how you're going to do programs and worship and actually even probably run services. So I know that that's a long discussion that you can have among yourself. Pray about that. Always looking for input from members of the church. But at this time, I think the identity for this church is our growth is going to come from migration. And I could be wrong, and I would like to see it flip. I would like to see that people are going to come to church that aren't going anywhere, that have been in Waxahachie for 20 years and just say, you know what, it's time to start coming to church.
Would that be considered conversion, or if they just go nowhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's a form of conversion. You're right. You're not necessarily converting from Roman Catholic to Lutherans, but there's a lot of lost people out there, right, that aren't going anywhere. And so if you think about that and you create that message that you're going to come from conversion, how is that going to work among lay people when they go to their working world? What are you guys going to do? So if you think it's going to be migration and you're focused that subconsciously it's migration, you're going to be more aggressive toward who? The newcomer. If you think it's from conversion, you're going to be more aggressive toward the people that's been around for a lot of years, not going anywhere. I would venture to say that as I've watched the ministry here now close to 3, I just don't see too many yet, making that effort to invite people in their community to come to church. John?
I think we should do it like as a group effort.
Oh, sure.
When I think about that, then my thought is, well, we have Easter services and Christmas services, and sometimes I think that the weather here in Texas would lend itself to us having a Christmas service and an Easter service outside.
Yeah.
And Lutherans have always been fond of saying, when we meet, we eat.
Yeah.
So if we were to have a Christmas service, weather permitting, an Easter service, weather permitting, why don't we have it outside and invite the community to come to the service and us feed,
Right.
Easter dinner or Christmas
Yeah.
dinner. And then the other thing that I was thinking, when I was talking to Dan about it on the way in, is that, we're talking about building a new church. And I remember growing up, like in the Catholic church, and the windows were, we didn't have
AC.
AC, and it was also in Wisconsin. So.
Yeah.
But, I always think about, well, what if the church, when we're singing and all of that, and we have windows open, again, weather permitting, that because music hits both sides of the head, if that could be something that we could do to bring the spirit.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up good ideas, and social ministry and outreach and the board of elders, I think, need to kind of conjuncture those kind of conversations and talks about how to do that. Brent?
From a village committee perspective, do you think this location provides that opportunity?
To be multinational?
No, to
Yeah.
John's talking
Yeah, to have the windows open? No, I don't think so. 287 is pretty loud, and if you got the windows open, and you're gonna have a hard time hearing me with the truck traffic. Yeah.
Well, heat and everything else are in.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Craig?
We do have another outreach to the diverse culture, and that's through our charities. We have given to, I've seen you give to Black families, Spanish families, and that's another way of reaching out to people. We have a great outreach to the Spanish people in Mexico.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I think that's another way that we can reach other people as an
Yeah.
outreach to.
Yeah, that's all mission, and that's granted. I'm just having the conversation kind of focus. How do we do it here? I just kind of believe a congregation should be reflective a little bit of the demographic of its local community. It just seems like that would be the right thing, you know. Vicki?
I really feel we have to go more towards the younger generation.
Yeah.
Because even this weekend, Hunter's went to First Baptist Church.
Mhm.
I even have to just take them over there because they have just so much, and it's the parents involved too.
Right.
They play basketball, but then they have their service, and then they have class.
Right.
But then they have every after them to play volleyball, to play basketball, to do things, to get them in.
Yeah, I mean, you're not talking just races, you're talking age demographics.
Right, but once you have something for them, that is different. I mean, there's hundreds of kids over there, and when I went to pick them up last night, it was all nationals. I mean, it was very diverse.
The kids
And
are
they're not even members.
Well, I mean, you can look at it like a restaurant, right? So look at the restaurants that have children in them. What do they have? They have playgrounds. They have a huge advertisement that says, you as a parent can eat and keep your sanity while your kids have something they'll enjoy.
Right.
And our church says old, stodgy people.
Yeah.
On the outside. Not to be, I mean, we've done a great job landscaping and trying to make it a little bit more welcoming.
Yes,
And
yeah.
Byron has done some amazing work
Mhm.
to beautify the church, but we still got a way to go.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's deterrents because we have some things around the building that make people nervous to put stuff like that out there because it invites
Yes.
other big
Yeah.
qualities, but there's such a thing as a myth. I mean,
There was a thing.
we can build things to make that, like, work, but there's just like, there's things you can do that
Yeah.
say that we're family oriented and
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah, I think the vision, the appearance of the church communicates that. You know, I remember Brent and Carl both have said something to the fact about having a playground here, and I shared with them that, you know, the word was that the fear of the playground was it was used, it got destroyed, stuff like that. And then Brent came up with the suggestion, well, we build two. We build one for the neighborhood and one for ourselves. I thought, well, now there's an idea. Yeah. So, Brent, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, and so we mentioned, in fact, our prior trustee just through building a huge pavilion outdoor facility, that John's talking about the services, outdoor meals, and visibility to the community, which is really important. But I think what I'm also hearing with Vicki talking about First Baptist Church, they just left downtown to be in a neighborhood, which is very important, right? They're out there immersed in neighborhoods, and it's easy for people, for families to come into. And that gave them the opportunity. One of the reasons was to give them that opportunity to have the new facilities like that, have enough land to have the playgrounds, have the basketball court, have the
Yeah.
everything.
That's why the challenge for the building committee is we want to go there, but the question is, do we really have enough land to make that happen?
Well, they're
You know?
287.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the location, but the extra land. They've got more than 3.5 acres.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
We're limited in the size of this.
Yeah.
But, you know, before, we had a basketball thing for all the kids. If they wanted to, they could come over here and play
Right.
basketball.
Yeah.
Now, can't have that out there because it's a liability to the church.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, how do you win?
You don't. You just take the risk. Yeah. I mean, you look at the whole mission stuff of Christ and the disciples. How many of the disciples died a natural death? One. I mean, did they not? Isn't Christianity a risk-taking business? So we have to remember that.
Not to throw another obstacle in our way, but the way the federal government is going is if we don't adhere to their guidelines and stuff, we're gonna lose our tax exempt.
Right. It's a risk-taking business there. Everywhere we go. God will always provide.
I would never sacrifice, I would never hold you over taxes.
You know, one of the things, I don't remember who got it, was John Eldridge. I would love to have all of our men read this book, Wild at Heart. John Eldridge, I think he was the author that wrote it, Wild at Heart. Have you read it? Yeah, it's a fascinating book. Have you read it, Craig? Wild at Heart? It's a story about why this guy theorizes why Christianity is now almost a woman's game. and men are falling away. And the story that he has, and the theory he has of why men are falling away, is because for some reason Christianity has lost its sense of adventurism. You know, men are adventure people. They like to seek thrills, and they like to take risk and seek adventure. And we've become so complacent in the Christian faith with since Christendom, 325, when all of a sudden the church became the religion of the state, and there was no risk in joining the church anymore, the pull for drawing men in isn't as strong anymore. I thought that was kind of interesting, that and then you're listening, like, going to put up a basketball hoop and reliability. Yeah, there's that same story that maybe we need to be a little bit more risk taking in our ministry and mission, and maybe if he's right, men will be drawn to that.
Well, if you have an inside basketball court, like the Methodist
Sure.
or the Baptist,
Yeah.
or whoever, are they not responsible for if a child who hurts themselves inside the facility?
Oh yeah. You know,
What's the difference?
when I coached AAU basketball and we were using all sorts of gyms all over the place, I had to carry with me constantly a rider, which freed the owner of the building from any injury on the premises. And the rider was an insignificant amount. It ran me, I charged it to the kids for AAU basketball. It ran like $2 or $3 a kid for a season for a rider. It was a very small amount of money to have a rider to go in and use that. But I had to carry that with me every game, every facility I used in case some injury got. But one thing you have to remember as a property owner is that these riders are only so good. It will not excuse you from gross negligence. So if you've done if that owner did something really stupid, like they didn't fix something or had a hole in the floor and they didn't fix that hole, and one of my basketball players tripped on it and got hurt bad, they would still be liable because they were doing gross negligence. So all of these liability release forms, as I've learned in youth camps and youth retreats, I get them signed. But that doesn't exclude me from a chaperone from gross negligence. I could still be sued if something happens, if I could be proven that I was totally negligent regardless of any waiver signed. It's risk taking. It's risk taking. You cannot get away from it. And maybe we need to kind of emphasize a little bit more about Christianity being risky. And because of what's happening in the federal government, maybe Christianity is going to be more of a risk taking thing.
Yeah, maybe when China.
Yeah, that's a lot of to be said there. That China, the Christianity seems to grow under persecution, under risk taking, and we've just become too complacent.
Most things do grow, you try to squash them.
Yeah. So just getting back to this clean and unclean discussion, Jesus mentions this now. But when does Peter have it? Does Peter have this experience of this vision after this conversation with Christ or before? When does Peter have his visit with Cornelius? After this conversation by Jesus or before? After, much words afterwards. I mean, this is after Pentecost. And what does Mark want to do? He gives you an annotation, right? In chapter 7, verse 19. He wants to say that Jesus had intent for saying this at this time because he wanted you to know what? How did Mark use this narrative to teach an important Christian insight? Puts it in parentheses. Yeah. See, now that's Mark's annotation. That's not Jesus. Mark, after this whole thing is all said and done, Jesus ascended to heaven, and Mark starts down to write his gospel. He puts this in parentheses to say, I'm going to notate this of why Jesus said this. He wants you to know that all foods are clean. He says this before even Peter has his vision. Jesus is a person thinking in the future. And where does the real fault lie, according to what Jesus says? Within man himself. Not from outside. And finally, ending up with this section, how did the disciples perceive how the Pharisees were reacting to the words of Jesus? Matthew 15:12, you got to go to that. Go to Matthew 15:12. It's the same narrative, but Matthew adds a little insight. How did the disciples see the Pharisee responding to what Jesus said? They were offended. Why would they be offended at this?
Blood. Blood.
Not necessarily blood. What did Jesus just say about them and their laws? Didn't matter anymore. You guys are a bunch of washed up white tombs. You know, we don't need you guys anymore. We don't need you to enforce this anymore. I mean, their whole life was based upon enforcing the law, and now he was actually undermining their authority. Nobody likes that. So Jesus offends them by this message, but let's be honest, the truth is offensive, correct? It's just the way it is. Any questions, comments? I appreciate the conversation we had today among all of us here, and a small group hopefully starts a discussion in a much bigger way. We need to kind of continue to work on what our identity is here at Christ the King and what our vision is going to be for the future and how this church is going to reflect Waxahachie. And I mean, those are all dreams. But the thing is, you don't go anywhere unless you have a dream. And then you make the dream what? A reality. But if you don't have it, what does the book of Proverbs say? Anybody? The people without a vision perish. Perish. People without a vision perish. You got to have something. Got to be shooting for something all the time. Like somebody has said, if you're not growing, you're dying. There's no such thing as maintenance ministry. It's just death. Diana, did you have something?
Yeah, I don't anyway, when I was growing up, we belonged to a church upstairs, and it was smack in the middle of a cutaway, lower income neighborhood. We had several acres. And at Thanksgiving, it was like one evening, they would have a huge Thanksgiving meal for everyone for free in the neighborhood. We had all kind of people coming, you know, it was out there, everybody knew it. And our church, and then also in the summer, we had enough property, same thing with a picnic, the whole neighborhood was free, they didn't expect anything. Our demographic was probably, that was mostly Hispanic, but it was probably a third Hispanic, and we had American Indian in that church. Yes. Yes. So, yeah.
Yeah. Is it St. Paul's in Oak Cliff? There's a St. Paul's in Oak Cliff, right?
I went to this church as a child,
Our second, yeah.
and I have the nursery as a child was that nursery friend. And then they had a playground outside.
Yeah, they had
the two things that I remember being so fond of.
Playground.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think there's a St. Paul's at Oak Cliff, and that's a predominantly African-American church there. And so there was a successful transfer of a demographic to match more of the community there. It's a challenge. It can be done. I've seen it at St. Paul and Oak Cliff done very well. I've seen it at St. John's in Gary, Indiana. Also, the guy knew what he was doing. I've seen it also work in St. Louis at Bethlehem Lutheran Church. You can make it happen, but this is the key. When you look at these three pastors that made it happen, they were intentional. And that's important. Intentional. They try to do the best to make the congregation also intentional. Yeah.
The church also has to have a heartbeat.
Yeah.
When people walk in these doors, and no offense to people mature in years, but when they see a lot of the same, they don't feel like, I mean, there's no children, and there's nobody, it's in the nursery, and it's just quiet in all the areas they need it to be bustling.
Right.
They're gonna walk out and be like, not for me.
Right. Yeah. It's a challenge.
It's been hard for me to grow up here, because I've been like,
yeah.
some of the nursery attendant just for my two kids.
Yeah. That's the thing is, how do you get it started? You can't get 50 young families in at the same time. If you can get 3 young families in and then have those families kind of really become your face, That's,
You could like the notes, I got iPads.
well, yeah, you know, but those are the ones that they'll tell you that they come and they go.
And they go.
But, yeah, you want someone that's gonna, you know, be supportive of your ministry. Yeah. You want someone supportive that's gonna stick around. But that's what you have to do. Even if you only have 3 young families, if that's what you want to do intentionally, those 3 young families have got to become the face of Christ the King. Right? Yeah. Yeah, they got to become the face.
Make sure that they feel they are wanted here and that we care about them. If we don't give them that, they're
Yeah.
not gonna stay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. But I think that's how you start. I think if that's what your intention is, the older demographic has got to support the younger ones and say, you are going to be the face of this church. How can we help you? And that's intentional. It's intentional. Yeah. Yeah. She's doing well. Doing good. Let's close with prayer. Father, we ask, O Lord, for you to continue to give us a vision for Christ the King and help us to be committed to it and to be, I guess no other word, but sold on it. We ask that you would therefore lead us into this vision and enable our church to rally around it as we seek to serve the community in which you've placed us. We, O Lord, have looked at places of whether or not Waxahachie is the best place. Midlothian, with those conversations have taken place, and constantly said, we belong here. We've got a ministry to do. Help us, O Lord, be led by your Spirit to know how that ministry should take place. Give us the resources to make it happen. We ask these things only in your grace and mercy and in accordance with your will. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Right out here.
Yeah.
And then we kept turning it up, so then we put a fence around it.
Yeah, they crawled up.